Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. I'm going to embark on a series of videos about the constitutional issues that arose during the 1920s and early 1930s when the mercurial Jack Lang was Premier of New South Wales. The reason for doing so is because this was a constitutionally interesting period of Australian history, when Australia was gaining independence at the national level, although interestingly not at the state level, and I'll return to deal with that in the videos at another time. This meant that there was uncertainty about the role of the governor. Did he have to give effect to the advice of his New South Wales ministers, or did he act according to the wishes of the British government, or even the King, as he was the King's personal representative? Added to that was the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, a whiff of revolution in the air, a clash over money with the Commonwealth Government, and ultimately the dismissal of the Lang Government in 1932. In this first video, I'm going to address Lang's first period in government from the 17th of June 1925 to October 1927 and his clashes with the Governor, Sir Dudley de Chair. But first, let me tell you a little of the history of Dudley de Chair, because it becomes relevant later. De Chair, as a 14-year-old in Britain, joined the Navy in 1878, inspired by stories of great derring-do. He trained on the HMS Britannia with two brothers, Eddie and George, and they became very good friends. At the age of 17, he left Eddie and George behind and headed off to war. There was a nationalist rebellion in Egypt led by Urabi Pasha, which threatened control over the Suez Canal. The British responded by sending in warships and marines. When one of the British forts was cut off by Egyptian forces, a volunteer was sought to break through the Egyptian lines and instruct the colonel in charge of the fort to evacuate, spike the guns, and head back to Alexandria. De Chair, at the age of 17, volunteered. On his first mission into enemy territory, De Chair was ambushed by the Egyptian cavalry and knocked unconscious from his horse. When he came to, he saw an enemy soldier kneeling on his chest, holding up a knife about to slash his throat. Not knowing what to do, he smiled at the man. This disconcerted the man so much that he picked De Chair up, put him on a horse and took him on horseback back to his camp to execute him there instead. Certain that he was going to die, De Chair decided to sing every song that he could remember at the top of his voice to keep his spirits up on his last journey. His captors were impressed by his courage. When he arrived at the camp, he was told that he would be hanged because Urabi did not waste ammunition on boys. But first he was taken before Urabi. Surprised at De Chair's youth, Urabi asked him whether, if he was released, he would fight again against the Egyptians. De Chair politely replied that he would naturally do his duty and fight again, but he would retain grateful recollections of his kind treatment. Urabi said that he wished his own army showed such spirit. He saved De Chair's life, sending him to Cairo as a prisoner of war, and even sending a telegram to De Chair's mother to let her know that he was safe and well. The British newspapers took up this story of the capture of the gallant young English midshipman, with illustrations of his capture being published in the newspapers. He became the symbol of heroism for the British campaign, and Queen Victoria expressed her hope that prayers would be offered in all churches for his safety. Now, if we were making a movie of this, we would now cut to the palace where De Chair was held, and the fragrant garden where he flirted with Urabi's enchanting daughter, as he described her. The Navy later found sketches of Urabi's daughter in De Chair's logbook and questioned him about them. De Chair was determined, however, to do his duty and escape, even though it was from a palace rather than a prison. But he argued with a fellow Italian prisoner who wanted to kill their captors as part of the escape. De Chair insisted that they were well treated and they should not harm anyone if they could avoid it. Their fight was overheard, the escape was thwarted, and the Italian was sent to a dungeon. On 15th of September 1882, Cairo was captured by the British and de Chair was freed. He was by then so famous in the British press that the telegram announcing victory in Egypt also announced de Chair's liberation. Before leaving, de Chair ensured that his Italian conspirator was freed from his dungeon, and he also gave a letter to his captors saying that they had treated him very well so that they could use that to protect themselves against any revenge taken by the British. We then move to the chase sequence of this story, where de Chair is sent with dispatches back to Alexandria as the only passenger on a train. Part of the train line was then recaptured by the Egyptians. De Chair ordered the train driver to keep going and push through enemy lines. They were shot at, but they made it through. De Chair led a distinguished naval career. He worked closely with Winston Churchill when he was First Lord of the Admiralty, and he was successful in blockading the North Sea during World War I. He later became an admiral. For anyone interested in his story, de Chair actually wrote a memoir with the not terribly inspiring title of The Sea is Strong, but there's also a much longer unpublished version of his memoir in the Imperial War Museum in London, which is where I gained quite a bit of material for this video. And I also wrote a chapter about de Chair in a book on the governors of New South Wales, from which this video is drawn. And for anyone interested in viceregal office and reserve powers, etc., this is actually a very good book. In 1923, de Chair was offered the governorship of New South Wales, which he accepted, arriving in Sydney in February 1924 to what he described as the most beautiful harbour in the world. And he's right, so see the opening sequence for all my videos. De Chair spent his leisure time sailing boats in the harbour and body surfing in the ocean. But this was the calm before the storm. A general election was held on the 20th of May 1925. It was very close. After a long period of recounts, Jack Lang was sworn in as Premier of a Labor government with a majority of 1 in the lower house. Lang and his party, however, did not have a majority in the more conservative upper house, the Legislative Council. The upper house was a nominated house where members held office for life. It was sometimes therefore called the House of Fossils. There was no upper number of members of the upper house, but the governors did exercise a discretion to refuse to swamp it with a large number of members from an incoming government, as otherwise the numbers would get completely out of control. An incoming government would usually be given a few appointments to help it pass its bills, for which it had an electoral mandate, but anything more was normally rejected. After the election, de Chair agreed with Lang to the appointment of 3 new members of the Legislative Council, and the appointments were made. But not long afterwards, Lang demanded the appointment of 25 more members. De Chair was concerned that they would be used to abolish the Legislative Council, as had happened in Queensland in 1922. He considered that Lang had no mandate for such action, as it had not been raised as a policy in the previous election. The Governor offered Lang 15 appointments, but Lang refused. In November 1925, Lang again sought 25 new members for the Legislative Council. De Chair sought advice from the Colonial Office. The British Secretary of State said that the matter was one that should be settled in New South Wales between the Governor and his ministers. De Chair concluded that this meant that he had personal discretion to decide the issue. Lang disagreed, concluding that it meant that de Chair had to act upon ministerial advice. Saying a matter had to be decided in Australia did not actually help in determining who had the ultimate power. The New South Wales Agent General in London told the Secretary of State that the Lang government had no intention of using the new appointees to abolish the Legislative Council before the next election. While Lang himself was evasive on the issue, saying that the government had not considered the issue of the abolition of the Legislative Council, both de Chair and the Secretary of State believed that they had been given assurances that no abolition bill would be introduced until after the next election, when Lang could say that he had a mandate. De Chair very reluctantly agreed to make the appointments on the 21st of December 1925 on the condition that the new members not be used to abolish the Legislative Council. Each of these appointees, however, had taken the pledge to implement the Labor platform, including the abolition of the Legislative Council. Just 1 month later, a bill to abolish the Legislative Council was introduced in the Legislative Council. To get the extra advantage of the absence of 3 opponents of abolition from Parliament, Lang then prorogued Parliament in order to break the pairing arrangement, which would otherwise have paired the votes of absent members against the votes of those who supported abolition. The bill then had to be reintroduced into the Legislative Council in February 1926. Unfortunately for Lang, some of his members quite enjoyed their time on the red leather benches of the Legislative Council. When it came to the vote, 2 of them crossed the floor and 5 of them just magically disappeared, so they didn't need to vote. De Chair, in his memoir, gave a rather comic description of the desperate search for the missing members and the shock of the defeat of the bill. All 7 of those who, in parliamentary Labor terms, ratted on the party were expelled from it. De Chair, after all this, was then astonished when Lang and his Attorney General, Edward McTiernan, then turned up to his office on the 4th of March 1826, seeking another 10 appointments to the Legislative Council. De Chair pointed out their despicable behaviour in breaching their commitments to him. De Chair recorded what he said to Lang. "I told him what I thought of him and the way in which he had deceived me, and I refused point blank to give him any more appointments." But Lang had not given up yet. When the Governor was conducting an ordinary Executive Council meeting with 2 ministers, the door in Government House burst open and Lang and the entire ministry entered. De Chair asked what they wanted, and Lang said he wanted to know whether De Chair intended to obstruct the work of Parliament and refuse ministerial advice. De Chair replied, "Until you give me a mandate from the people that they wish the upper house abolished, I will not give you another member." Lang decided to bypass De Chair and go to the top. He sent McTiernan off to the United Kingdom to petition the King and the Secretary of State to instruct De Chair to act on the advice of his ministers. The Secretary of State, Leo Amery, told McTiernan that it would not be proper for him to issue instructions to the Governor about his constitutional duties. Behind the scenes, however, Amery did write to De Chair, noting that he, Amery, had previously received very explicit assurances that there would be no attempt to get rid of the upper house, and that Lang was clearly playing, quote, "a very shifty game," unquote. In the circumstances, Amery thought De Chair was justified in not giving further appointments and said that he would support De Chair in the face of any demands to have him recalled as Governor. But De Chair had even higher support. Remember at the beginning when I mentioned his good friends Eddie and George that he trained with in the Navy as a teenager? Eddie was the eldest son of King Edward VII and the heir to the throne. At the age of 28, when he was engaged to Princess Mary of Teck, he died of influenza during a pandemic. His younger brother George was then told that he had to marry Mary and become king. So when Lang, through McTiernan, petitioned the king to instruct or recall De Chair, he was actually petitioning the king's childhood friend. Sir John Goodwin later gave this account to De Chair of a lunch that he had with King George and Queen Mary in Windsor. And this is what he said. "The king appeared very angry with Lang, the existing Premier of New South Wales, and said, 'That Lang wants to recall De Chair. Damn him! I will recall Lang if he's not careful. And then he banged the table, saying, I would like to break Lang's head. The Queen said, You will break something, dear, if you're not careful. Yes, said the King, the idea of treating de Chair like that. De Chair, of all people, a great friend of mine. I'm sorry that my son will have to meet this Premier when he goes out to Australia. End of story. I rather love that quote because you can really imagine it happening, especially the comment by Queen Mary about him breaking something. As you probably guessed by now, the King was not keen on giving instructions to de Chair to obey the advice of Jack Lang, and nor was he prepared to recall de Chair as governor. Back home in New South Wales, there was dissent within the Labor Party about Lang's leadership. A leadership challenge by Peter Lachlan resulted in a tie, which was only broken when Lang got McTiernan's vote by telegraph from the ship on which he was returning from London. De Chair noted in a letter that he thought some in the Labor Party wanted him to dismiss Lang to allow them to consolidate and unify the party. An attempt by Lachlan to bring down the Lang government on the 22nd of November 1926 also failed, but only just. In May 1927, Lang told the governor he wanted him to grant him a dissolution in secret. Lang wanted to keep this secret dissolution in his pocket as a threat against ministers he considered disloyal. De Chair said that he would only grant a dissolution publicly. He called for a meeting of the full Executive Council and asked each minister whether they wanted a dissolution. Lang said yes, and all the others said no, although some accounts say that there was one minister who also agreed with Lang and wanted a dissolution. The governor, therefore, did not grant an immediate dissolution, but he told Lang that he would reappoint Lang as Premier if he resigned. Now, this form of resignation and reappointment is a common way for a Premier to clear out his ministry and replace them, because the resignation of a Premier includes the termination of the entire ministry. If Lang were reappointed as Premier, he could then advise the governor to appoint a new ministry, discarding those ministers that he no longer trusted. But the governor said he would only do so on the condition that Lang would advise a dissolution as soon as the electoral rolls were revised and an election could reasonably be held, and that Lang acted in a caretaker capacity in the meantime. Lang accepted. He resigned and was reappointed, and he advised the governor on a new ministry. Lang also took great delight in ordering all the ministerial car drivers to return to their garage so that when the dismissed ministers left their offices, they discovered that they had to take public transport home. Loud were the wails of anguished souls stripped of their glory, said Lang. The election was held in October 1927. Lang and his government were defeated. A nationalist Country Party coalition was elected, but it was not smooth sailing because the Great Depression was brewing on the horizon. Well, that's the end of this episode on the first Lang government, where we had an angry king, disputes about who advised the governor, a battle over swamping the Legislative Council and trying to abolish it, and a rather peculiar process for heading to an election. Join me next time on the Constitutional Clarion for a video about the plot by the New Guard to overthrow the second Lang government. I'll see you then. Goodbye.